They're doing what they should be doing, perhaps, for the European Union, but it does create ill will. And as you know, we're going to be doing reciprocal tariffs. So whatever they charge us, we're charging them.
Today, we will witness one of the most dramatic moments in North American trade history. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney declared that the era of the old friendship with the US is over, and now Ottawa is ready to use its trump cards, energy, auto, and agriculture, to retaliate. But what does this mean for the relationship between the world's two largest economies?
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
Have you ever wondered what could happen if Canada decided to flip the switch and stop supplying electricity to the US? It could be a real disaster for the North American economy. In 2024, Canada transmitted about 65 terawatt-hours of electricity to the US, which was 20% of consumption in some states. Now that Ottawa is starting to threaten higher taxes and restrictions on electricity exports, what does this mean for industries that run on Canadian energy? Could it jeopardize thousands of jobs and raise the cost of living for millions of Americans? The answers to these questions remain to be found, but the fact remains that escalation has already begun. But this is just the beginning. In addition to energy, Canada has billions of dollars in automotive and agricultural ties to the United States. Canada's auto industry generated more than $30 billion in export revenue in 2024, with most of those cars and auto parts going to the US. What happens if Ottawa decides to impose new tariffs on US cars? Technologies that are intertwined within a single industrial network risk being disrupted. Could Canadian tariffs jeopardize the operations of giants like Tesla, or is this just the beginning of more serious moves?
Well, when you look at the kind of input Musk has been having into politics, there has been some polling done which suggests there is a strong dissatisfaction with...
And yes, don't forget agriculture. Canada is one of the U.S.'s biggest agricultural partners, supplying huge amounts of commodities like wheat, meat, and dairy products. What happens if Ottawa decides to use its influence in this area and impose additional tariffs? Already, experts are warning that this could lead to higher food prices in the US and affect millions of Americans who depend on Canadian imports. All of this raises the question, how strong is trade between the US and Canada? In 2024, mutual trade totaled more than $900 billion. But what will that figure look like if the countries continue to feud? And most importantly, is it possible to resolve this crisis peacefully? Or are we in for a new round of Cold War on trade fronts? Will Canada be left with the option of continuing to play on the side of Europe and Asia, strengthening its independence from the US? Or will Washington decide to go even tougher, hurting both economies?
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year, in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
This conflict unfolding right in front of us is not just political. It touches the hearts of millions of people whose lives depend on stability on both sides of the border. How will the situation unfold? The answers to these questions are in our video. The recent turnaround in relations between Canada and the United States was a landmark moment in the history of the two countries. Trade and economic ties between the two countries, which seemed stable for decades, are now undergoing a major shake-up. While Canada has long been considered an important partner and ally of the US, the role it now plays on the world stage may be changing. The current situation demonstrates how tariff wars, political rhetoric, and economic dependence can change the balance of power in North America. This process has begun to unfold against the backdrop of increasing political tensions between Washington and Ottawa, where every move is causing growing unease on both sides. The main reason for the deterioration of relations was the decision of Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who publicly stated that he no longer sees the point of old-fashioned closeness with the United States. In his speech on March 27, 2025, Carney noted that the era of friendship and unity is over, and now Canada will act solely in its own interests, while not hesitating to use its strategic resources to pressure Washington. This statement immediately drew the attention of experts and political observers on both sides of the border. Many saw it as an attempt to attract attention on the eve of the election, but the situation developed faster than expected. Just a few days after the statement, Canada took steps that show it has no intention of backing down.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
First and foremost, Canada began using its energy resources as leverage. A country that possesses abundant natural resources such as oil, gas, and hydroelectricity can not only significantly affect the cost and stability of energy supplies, but also the strategic security of the United States. In particular, Canada exports significant amounts of oil, gas, and electricity to the US. According to recent data, Canadian oil shipments to the United States will total more than $70 billion by 2024, nearly one-fifth of oil imports to the United States. This dependence on Canadian energy resources is clear, and experts are confident that any shift in supply could have devastating consequences for US economic stability. However, the situation became even more dramatic when Canada began threatening to cut off electricity supplies to the United States. Canada is known to have some of the most powerful hydroelectric power plants in the world, and its ability to export cheap electricity to the US plays a key role in powering America's northern regions. In 2024, Canada transferred about 65 terawatt-hours of electricity to the US, accounting for 20% of consumption in some areas of the US. The potential interruption of these supplies has caused panic in Washington, as it would immediately raise electricity costs and have a direct impact on industrialized areas in the northern US where electrical electricity plays a critical role in the production process. The energy crisis that would occur if supplies were cut off could disrupt thousands of factories and businesses, including in key sectors such as steel and automobiles. Canada has also expressed a willingness to use its energy leverage more forcefully, hinting at the possibility of shifting oil and gas supplies to other countries, such as Europe and Asia. In doing so, Ottawa is actively demonstrating its ability to seek alternative markets and diversify its supply. On March 27, 2025, in an interview, Prime Minister Carney noted that his country is ready to develop alternative trade channels and reduce its dependence on the US market. He emphasized that Canada has no obligation to continue trading with the US if it does not bring benefits, and that unjustified unilaterals from Washington undermine relations between the two countries. Carney said that economic and energy independence have become key priorities for Canada, adding to the sense of uncertainty in US circles.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
However, it should be noted that in reality, the US does depend heavily on Canadian energy supplies. This is not just an economic issue, but a security issue, as much of Canada's oil comes from regions that are strategically important to the US. Without these supplies, many US states, especially in the east and north, will face energy shortages, which could lead to higher fuel and electricity prices. With such a scenario, the US will be forced to look for other sources of supply, which will take years, if not decades, to establish new stable supply channels with other countries. In the meantime, the US is trying to respond to Carney's actions and is considering new sanctions, including higher tariffs on Canadian goods, such as automobiles, agricultural products, and other key exports. Canadian officials have already said they are prepared for these measures and have warned that they will respond to any increase in tariffs by the US with additional measures. On March 28, 2025, Canada's trade minister noted that the country will protect its economic interests despite the potential consequences. He emphasized that Canada will not relent in the fight for fair trade and intends to use all available means to protect its national interests. As for the US, the Trump administration is increasingly nervous about the growing threat of economic damage from Canadian retaliatory measures. While the Trump administration has openly stated its willingness to increase tariffs, observers have noted that the US is genuinely worried about how this situation could affect its economy. This includes the threat of closing the Canadian market to US agricultural products, which make up a significant portion of Americans' food basket. Could food prices in the US skyrocket? Could Canadian farmers stop supplying key agricultural commodities? The answers to these questions are still unclear, but concerns about the possible consequences are growing.
Tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
As for Canada itself, there is growing support for Prime Minister Carney's tough policies. Canadians, tired of external pressure, support the course of national independence and believe that the country should use all its levers to protect its economy. Energy independence and trade partnerships with Europe and Asia are now seen as a priority, and even though there may be short-term losses, Carney and his government are confident that the long-term benefits will justify the current risks. The situation with Canada and the US is much more complicated when it comes to two other important aspects of bilateral trade: the auto industry and agriculture. These sectors are closely intertwined in the economies of both countries, and any attempt to interfere could cause powerful economic repercussions that are far from predictable. Already, Washington and Ottawa are beginning to realize that tariff wars between the countries could go beyond the energy crisis, affecting critical industries that provide jobs and prosperity for millions of people. The automotive industry plays one of the most important roles in both countries' economies. Canada exported more than $30 billion worth of automobiles and auto parts to the US in 2024, and despite the challenges, continued to be a critical supplier to the US auto industry. Many US auto plants depend on Canadian parts produced within Canada and on collaborations with Canadian manufacturers to assemble vehicles for the US market. In response to threatening US moves, such as the imposition of new tariffs on Canadian cars, Ottawa has begun to actively strategize a response. Prime Minister Carney said Canada could impose new tariffs on US autos and vehicles, which he said would naturally disrupt the entire supply chain in the auto industry and increase the cost of producing cars in the United States. Carney also stressed that the decision to raise tariffs or introduce new taxes on American cars would not be about protecting only Canadian interests, but about establishing fair trade relations between neighbors. In turn, the situation in the United States is already causing concern. Experts warn that the introduction of new tariffs could significantly increase the cost of cars, which in turn will lead to higher prices for consumers. An auto industry analyst in Detroit said that if Canada imposes additional duties on components from the US, many production lines will be forced to stop. Representatives of major auto brands, such as Ford and General Motors, say that such measures could paralyze production in the US, affecting jobs and the economies of several states. Some even say that the new tariffs may lead to the actual closure of some plants in the US, which will cause mass layoffs and social unrest. All of this adds to the heat of tension, with no easy way out of the situation.
Including Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon. President Trump with the Irish Prime Minister visiting the White House today. The president suggesting his tariffs won't stop here, saying, "Of course, I'm going to respond." And tonight, right here, the new poll showing 56% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the economy. The number's even worse now on the president's tariffs. ABC's chief White House correspondent Mary Bruce leading us off.
Today, President Trump side by side in the Oval Office with the head of the Irish government.
However, Carney said that Canada is not afraid to hit US manufacturers if they continue to impose unfair trade terms on it. In his words, "We will no longer put up with the US treating us as a weak partner." In parallel, the Canadian government is beginning to look for new markets for its products. In particular, Carney noted that working with Europe and Asia will allow Canada to not only offset potential losses from reduced exports to the US, but also strengthen its economy in the long term. These words are shaking up the market, and experts are beginning to predict a possible redistribution of automotive market share if Canada begins to redirect its shipments toward the European Union and Asian countries. In addition, amidst this economic unrest, questions have also arisen about the mutual dependence of Canada and the US in the agriculture industry. Canada is one of the largest suppliers of agricultural products to the US. In 2024, mutual trade in this area totaled about $45 billion, with key commodities such as meat, dairy products, wheat, and canola. Most notable are shipments of Canadian wheat, which plays a critical role in the US food industry. US agricultural producers, including animal farmers, rely heavily on Canadian feed and feed additives. But what happens if Ottawa decides to use its agricultural trade ties as leverage? Given that the price of goods in the US could skyrocket if new tariffs are imposed on Canadian products, there is a real threat that food inflation in the US could spiral out of control. The issue would be particularly acute for major supermarket chains, which would be forced to increase prices on basic food items such as milk and meat, which in turn would hit the wallets of American consumers. In this situation, Canada's ability to adapt quickly and utilize its strategic resources in the energy and high-tech sectors will be key. The Canadian market may attract investors looking for alternatives to the US, given the decreased stabilization in the North American economy. On the other hand, continued US pressure on Canada can only increase its desire to become a more independent player on the world stage. Already, Ottawa is making plans to diversify its export destinations and seek new trading partners. The move may not only be a response to threats from Washington, but also a strategy aimed at the country's long-term economic security. With each new move by Canada to improve its relations with other parts of the world, questions are being raised more and more about the future of trade relations in North America. All of this will have its own long-term implications for the US, as due to Canada's strengthening position in Europe and Asia, US companies could lose an important partner. This leads to the fact that the US will now have to find new markets for its goods, leading to new economic and political challenges. The potential expansion of Canadian ties with other countries could also affect the political alliances that exist between the US and Canada, and even security, as it would be difficult for the US to ignore Canada's strengthening position on the international stage. Uncertainty in relations between countries increases mutual risks. In case Ottawa decides to completely leave the framework of traditional trade agreements with the US and focus on Europe and Asia, there will be not only economic but also political consequences. The US could perceive such moves as a threat to its influence in North America, which could lead to harsher measures from Washington. However, Carney and his government seem determined, arguing that even if Canada suffers short-term losses, it can strengthen its long-term position on the international stage. After all, such moves could open new horizons for Canada, giving the country independence in key economic, energy, and industrial decisions. All of these developments in the trade conflict underscore the scale and interdependence of today's global markets. Canada, despite its smaller economy compared to the US, finds itself in a unique position to capitalize on its status as a key energy and industrial partner to create strategic leverage. US experts, on the one hand, suggest that such a dramatic change in Canadian behavior could result in a short-term economic shock, but on the other hand, they recognize that it would be extremely difficult for the US to completely abandon Canadian supplies. No matter how difficult this would be for bilateral relations, this trade crisis also raises the question for global markets: who will regulate this relationship in the future and how? If relations between the US and Canada continue to deteriorate, other countries such as Mexico could also come into play, creating additional difficulties for the US to find new trading partners. In this context, it is possible that a trade war, if it continues, could lead to an economic disconnect between North America and other global markets, jeopardizing the economic stability of the entire Americas. Canada's future, if it does decide to revise its foreign trade policy and move beyond close ties with the United States, will depend on the government's ability to balance its own interests with global demands. The most important question remains how exactly the country will develop its energy, automotive and agricultural policies, creating a sustainable and independent economy that can withstand any international pressures.